This is Tony Arend, and welcome to SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar brings distinguished members of the Georgetown faculty and alumni community together to talk about some of the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Now, today, it is a very special honor and privilege to bring in, now I'm reluctant to say this, an old friend, Professor Elizabeth Campbell, because she's not old. She is a friend, and I have known her since, well, let's say 1993, 1994. She was 2 years old at the time, for those people doing math out there. Professor Campbell is a professor of history at the University of Denver in Colorado, so she is joining us from her office in Colorado. She is also the director of the Center for Art Collection Ethics at the University of Denver. When I knew her, she had just graduated as a student from the School of Foreign Service in 1992. In her studies, she spent time at Sciences Po in France and also at the Sorbonne. She then went to New York University, where she earned her master's degree and her PhD in history. She has written widely in the field and has published numerous articles and books. The one book you see there on the screen, and I do in fact have a copy of that book here with me in DC, will be the topic of her present. She's got a lot of books. By the way, next time I see you, Professor Campbell, you're gonna have to sign this book for me. Her previous book is entitled Defending National Treasures, French Art and Heritage under Vichy, which was published by Stanford University Press. This book, her current book, which is available on Amazon for all folks out there, Worthy Nazi Art Plunder in Postwar Western Europe, is published by Oxford University Press. And Professor Campbell is going to talk a little bit about that book, present on that book, and then I may ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the great Georgetown community out there. So, Professor Campbell, welcome to the webinar, and let me turn it over to you and say it's an honor to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. It's such an honor to be here, especially as an SFS alumna. It was, excuse me, really at Georgetown where I developed my passion for French history. And during my year of study abroad at Sciences Po, when I decided to become a historian of modern French history. So thank you so much for inviting me here today. Thank you for everybody who's joining. And also I want to extend thanks to Kelly Young, who's the Director of Career and Lifelong Learning at Georgetown, for handling a lot of the logistics behind this event. It's really a pleasure to be here. And yes, as Professor Arend mentioned, I have a new book that is just out. I received my own copy exactly a week ago. So it's still very exciting to actually have it in hand. And I'll just give a brief overview of the book today, and then be sure to leave time for questions. So there's one central question that I wanted to answer in this book, and that is, how did thousands of works of art that had been looted by the Nazis end up in Europe's most prestigious museums? We're talking about the Louvre, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels. Most of these works had been stolen or were sold under duress by Jewish owners, either collectors or art dealers. To us today, this obviously seems wrong. From an ethical standpoint, how could these museums hold on to works that had belonged to victims of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust? And potentially legally wrong, as has been shown in many lawsuits over the last several decades. So I wanted to understand that process, and I'll explain a little bit more how I got interested in the whole subject of Nazi art looting. As Professor Arend mentioned, my first book, Defending National Treasures, was based on my doctoral dissertation from NYU. It was looking at how the French were trying to protect what they call their patrimoine national, or their national cultural heritage. I was really interested in this period of the German occupation of World War II and how they were working to protect their museums, art collections, historic sites, all of those churches and chateaux that attract tourists every year, how did they protect them under the German occupation? Nazi art looting became a much bigger part of that story than I had initially anticipated. So I was doing this work in the late 1990s, and I was also aware that the French government still held around 2,000 works of art that had been plundered under the Nazis. And my work was influenced by a couple important books from the time period. Lynn Nicholas was a writer who wrote this path-breaking study of Nazi art looting and the restitution effort. Journalist Hector Feliciano was working in France at the time. He was really focusing on those 2,000 works of art that were kept by the French government. French archives related to this topic were still classified at the time, so he was largely relying on US archives and was able to trace some pieces to likely rightful owners. So I was really influenced by those works. I also was aware that France was not the only country that held on to works that had been plundered by the Nazis. I knew that this was also the case in the Netherlands and in Belgium. And there had never been a comparative study of these three countries. And I was really interested in figuring out, how were these policies implemented? How are they justified? And how were they carried out differently in those three countries? So that was my task in this second book. So let's start with well, first I was going to give you a case study. I'll come back to that. Also, some of you might be aware of this topic from popular books and films that have come out in recent years. Robert Edsel is a successful businessman who made a second career out of studying the cultural officers who repatriated works of art from repositories in the Third Reich to the countries of origin. These are the famous Monuments Men. Robert Edsel created the Monuments Men Foundation, which has recently been renamed the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, which is very important. I always like to point out that women did play a key role in the repatriation and restitution effort. So there's a film directed by George Clooney that came out in 2014. You can see the star-studded cast. It's a combination of fact and fiction, and I have written about that in a few different pieces. It had the benefit of bringing this history to a much wider audience, and so you may be familiar with some of this history from those popular works. There's also the film Woman in Gold, which came out in 2015 with Helen Mirren playing the role of a claimant from California who received several Klimt paintings from the Republic of Austria. I think this is a much better film. It really delves into the legal complexities of that kind of international case. So I do recommend that one as well if you've not seen it yet. Okay, so let's start with just a case study of the image that's on the cover of the book. So this is a painting by Fernand Léger, obviously a Cubist artist, modernist from the early 20th century. This is called Woman in Red and Green. So what do we know about the history of this painting? It was purchased by the French and Jewish art dealer Léonce Rosenberg in 1921, and by 1941 had ended up in the gallery of his brother, Paul Rosenberg. Paul was one of the most prominent art dealers in France on the eve of World War II, and had a very strong reputation internationally, and especially focusing on modernist pieces. He was the key art dealer for Picasso. He worked out arrangements with artists so that he would become their main dealer, and he had a number of works by Léger. On the eve of World War II, he could see the troubles that were ahead, and he started to shift some of his art stock to New York. He was among the wealthy and politically connected Jewish people who were able to escape. And so in 1940, he was able to flee with other members of his family, and he established a gallery on the Upper East Side in New York. In the meantime, he had left behind the properties in France and the art stock that remained. The Nazis took over the property. They seized works of art from storage repositories and ended up plundering around 400 works of art. And keep in mind, we're talking about modern masterpieces, a good number of Picasso's, Matisse's, and Léger paintings. So the Nazis set up a collecting point for plundered works of art in Paris at the Jeu de Paume Museum. And there's a room in that museum that held modern pieces. And you can see I've drawn a red box around our Leger painting. You can see on the wall. Now, these modernist works were labeled degenerate by the Nazis. At the time, they were working to build a massive art collection for Hitler. He wanted to establish a great museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria. Now, these modernist pieces were considered degenerate, and so they weren't seen as being high enough quality for that museum collection. But for the curators and the dealers working for Hitler, they were still useful because they could be sold on the art market, which was booming during the occupation in Paris, in Amsterdam, and in Brussels. They could sell these pieces on the art market and use the proceeds to purchase the more traditional paintings that they wanted for the Linz collection, or they could exchange them. And that's what happened with the Leger painting. It was exchanged along with several other works for a more traditional piece that a dealer working for Hitler wanted for the Linz collection. So it might seem surprising that a painting that is this striking could fall through the cracks. It was recovered from a repository in Germany. The monuments men and women did repatriate it to France, but Léonce Rosenberg did not claim it by 1947, the year that he died. Paul Rosenberg also did not claim it. And again, it might seem surprising. How could he misplace a modern masterpiece like this? But when you look at the inventories of the works that Rosenberg was claiming, and he was doing much of this work himself while running the gallery in New York, there are lists of works of art with rather vague titles like Woman in Red and Green, and you start to understand how a major work like this could fall through the cracks. He did not submit the claim, and according to the restitution process, the claimants needed to provide evidence of ownership. If that claim didn't come forward, the government was under no legal obligation to look at the work of art and do the ownership research or provenance research to try to find the rightful owner. They did not have that legal obligation, and they felt no ethical obligation either. And I think that's really the dimension that has interested me the most, is a shift in notions of ethics. So what does the French government do with unclaimed art? The best ones, the ones that were considered museum worthy, hence the title of the book, they decided to keep. They created a custodianship. They were not fully integrated into the national collection, and so people could still submit claims. If they could provide proof of ownership, there was still the possibility of restitution, but they created a custodianship for the best pieces that could be shown in museums, in palaces, ministries, embassies. This is a way of providing decor for French public buildings. Then the ones that didn't fit that criteria would be sold at auction, and the French treasury deposited the proceeds. So they benefited either way, either from keeping the work of art itself or selling other pieces on the art market. And so this is what they did with the Leger painting. They selected it in 1949, and it was on display at the National Museum of Modern Art starting in 1951. So Hector Feliciano, the author that I mentioned earlier, had studied this piece in his book that came out in 1995. And the Rosenberg descendants learned of this case through his book and submitted a claim to the French government. They finally did the research that they should have done decades prior and did restitute the painting in 2003. The Rosenberg descendants then sold it, and it's now in a private collection. But I wanted to better understand that key period in the late 40s and early 50s and what happened and the policies that were enacted in all three of these countries. So this slide gives us some statistics, and if you really want to do a deep dive, I recommend consulting the book, but I'll draw your attention to a couple figures here. I want to point out the relatively high restitution rate in France. So if we look at the different circumstances of plunder in all three countries, we're talking about obviously a much larger country, There are also more large-scale Jewish-owned collections in France. So the scale of the plunder was far greater in France, and repatriation as well. So France receives over 60,000 items and restitutes a relatively high number of them. There is a genuine effort among government officials to restitute in cases where rightful ownership was clear. And this left still thousands of items that were unclaimed. The government chose around 2,100 items and sold the rest at auction. Those works held in the custodianship are commonly known as the MNR objects. That stands for Musée National Récupération. And originally it was a label intended for modern paintings, but the acronym really is used now for all of the pieces in the custodianship. If we compare it to the Netherlands, we see that the numbers are quite different, and our records aren't equal in all three cases. So the Dutch were not as diligent as the French in tracking the works of art that were coming in. So we don't have as much documentation to have equal statistics in all three cases. But we at least can see that there were far fewer that had either been sold or plundered, stolen from the Netherlands, and also fewer repatriated. And we see a far lower restitution rate, and I'll get into the reasons why in a moment. The Dutch ended up holding around 4,000 works of art in a type of custodianship also that's called the NK collection. In the Dutch case, they are considered part of the national collections. In Belgium, you can see even fewer items. There are just fewer wealthy Jewish art collectors to begin with, and so there's less in terms of plunder of fine art from Belgium, fewer items coming back in, but of those that were returned to Belgium, a quite low restitution rate of around 7%, with about 600 works held by the post-war government. So why the difference in these statistics? So there's a higher concentration of those wealthy owners in France. That's an important statistic. About 5% of those who had lost works of art owned 75% of plundered items. So we're talking about collectors like the Rothschild family, Kahn, Seligman, Rosenberg, that are claiming hundreds of items. They have extensive documentation. They have insurance policies, photographs. They have servants who can help identify high quality furniture that they had been dusting. They have the ability to claim these items. French government officials are familiar with those collections. So for the big owners, that restitution process is much more straightforward, even though, as we saw, even for a major dealer like Rosenberg, works of art were not always restituted. In addition, France had competent cultural leadership. There were effective civil servants that had been serving through the period of the Vichy regime. These were not ardent collaborationists. In fact, they more often had supported the resistance, and they maintained their positions through the post-war period. And so this helps to explain the higher restitution rate in France. In the Netherlands, there's a higher proportion of works that were sold under duress, and this creates a lot of complications with restitution even to this day. A key reason is that it remains difficult to prove sales under duress. The Nazis were very smart in how they negotiated these deals. So they would approach a collector, threaten them, manipulate them, offer protection if a collector would sell works to them, draw up a contract that was signed by the owner, and then acquire the works of art in that manner. It has taken decades for the international community, art experts, to recognize that that's a sale under duress. In the early post-war years, it was considered a valid sale. In addition, even if a claimant get to the point of proving rightful ownership, if a work had been sold, they also had to pay the sale price. The Dutch government took the approach that if a work was sold, a claimant couldn't benefit from the proceeds of the sale and restitution. They'd be benefiting twice. However, many of those families didn't have access to the money. They didn't actually receive the funds from the sale. They also had to pay taxes and fees. So for many of those claimants, there are just too many obstacles to recover works of art, and it was not financially feasible. Often it was the next generation that was trying to recover the family's property, and the older generation, in some cases, had been arrested. And so it was the next generation trying to recover these works of art, and it was just not financially feasible for them to do so. In addition, there was also just corruption in the main agency that was running the restitution process. So that's also a factor to explain a lower restitution rate in the Netherlands. In Belgium, we have fewer still fine art collections that were in place at the beginning of the war. We see a bigger impact of the Nazis' furniture operation. So this was an effort to get not museum quality furniture, but daily use household objects, including furniture, that would be shipped to the Third Reich and were used to help settle ethnic Germans in Poland and given to German families that had been victims of Allied bombing. So there's a higher proportion of the furniture operation having an impact in Belgium, and as in the Netherlands, mismanagement of the agency that was in charge of restituting works of art for those that did return to Belgium. So those are some differences in the scale of looting and in restitution and the policies of restitution. But what I found so interesting in looking at all three of these cases is an overriding similarity, and that's in the justification of holding on to unclaimed works of art as a way of enriching the national heritage. And again, the French term that's used here is the patrimoine national. Government officials were quite enthusiastic about the prospect of having this cache of unclaimed art that could be used to strengthen their national collections. This is in the context of Reconstruction, when so much of the funds of these national governments had to go into the rebuilding process to recover from the devastation of World War II. They were competing on the art market with buyers in the United States, which was becoming a major force in the art world. Having these unclaimed works of art was an opportunity to enrich the national heritage. And that is the dominant idea that comes through in meeting minutes, correspondence, reports. That was a key objective in all three of these cases. So this status quo lasted for several decades. And it really took the work of the writers and journalists in the mid-1990s to start investigating Holocaust era assets. That was also, of course, the end of the Cold War, and governments of Europe were declassifying their archives. And with those investigations, there's a greater awareness of Holocaust era assets. You might remember like the Swiss banking scandal and class action lawsuits that originated from the United States. So there was a broad investigation into a wide range of Holocaust era assets, not just art collections. By the late 1990s, the governments in all three countries created study commissions to figure out the extent of looting and spoliation, collaboration by their own predecessors, and to try to figure out how to restitute assets at that point, so going beyond art collections. The Dutch were the most proactive in looking at the 4,000 works of art that they had held that had been acquired after the repatriation efforts, and starting from the work of art and doing the provenance research to try to locate rightful owners. So they started this process in the early 2000s. This is a screenshot of a database that's available today. You can see that you can search for items in English or in Dutch. And you can also see a figure there that about 470 works have been restituted, and that's mostly since the early 2000s. There were a couple big cases in the early 2000s of 200 objects each going to descendants of Jacques Houtstikker and Fritz Gutmann, so that helps to explain those numbers. That they were the first among the three countries to have a proactive effort in doing this research. It took the French quite a bit longer. And in my first book, which came out in 2011, I am quite critical of the French government at that point, because there had been the study commission that came out in 2000, but I felt did not go deep enough into the investigation of how those M&R pieces had been handled. And in my opinion, there was still a lack of transparency about those items and a lack of systematized provenance research. It actually took until 2019 for this effort to be underway in France. And here's a screenshot of a website that also provides links to a database where one can also search for works of art. But it's not enough to put this information out on a website. What's required is to do that provenance research, to start from the object and to try to locate rightful owners. The French have been doing this to a much greater extent, and I can give you a figure that is quite striking. So once the initial period of research ended in 1955, over the next 40 years, there were only 4 restitutions. In contrast, since 2020, there have been 40 restitutions. So we went from 4 over 50 years to 4 in the last 3 years. I'm sorry, 40 in the last 3 years. So it shows the power of provenance research. And also the French government has been working with genealogists, since we're moving farther and farther away from the moments of theft or sale, that they really need to be working with genealogists to try to figure out the rightful owners. The Belgians have been the least proactive in this area. In their case, they've been influenced by an effort to do more research into colonial items. So for Belgium, that has actually been the area that has pushed more provenance research, particularly items from Africa. And so that has helped to drive also an effort to do research on works from the Nazi era as well. There was one important restitution from early in 2022, which at least signals a willingness and an effort by the Belgian government to also carry out this provenance research. But so I'm a faculty member at the University of Denver, and in addition to my teaching and scholarship, I also have decided that I really want to play a role in trying to promote ethical museum stewardship, so working beyond academe. So in 2018, I helped to create a Center for Art Collection Ethics at the University of Denver. We serve as a clearinghouse of information on issues related to ethical stewardship. This is not only Nazi era pieces, but colonial and indigenous items, antiquities, and we hold public events, panel discussions about important issues in the museum world today. We also train people to carry out provenance research. There's no other program in the country that does this outside of a degree program. We bring in applicants from all over the country. We've had people coming even internationally. We had 2 students last year from France who participated in our program. Just knowing that there are very few opportunities today for people to learn how to do provenance research. So we offer this training program. I work with top provenance researchers in the country, and we're really working to promote ethical stewardship in this rising generation of curators who will eventually go on to run museums in the United States, because we need to be carrying out this provenance research here as well. We're also training people in the art market, so that's an important element of promoting ethical stewardship. So if you're interested in any of our programs, you can find more information here. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
So thank you very much, Elizabeth. That fantastic overview. And I have a couple of questions. I want to invite people to go into your control panel and ask questions that I will then pose to Professor Campbell. But a couple of questions that come immediately to my mind. One is, so if I owned a Picasso, which if anybody's thinking I don't own a Picasso, but if I owned a Picasso, I could lend it to, say, the Baltimore Museum of Art. And if I were to walk into the Baltimore Museum of Art, it would say such and such by Picasso, it would give a year, and then it would say on loan from the collection of Anthony Clark Arendt. So here's a question. During the period of custodianship, where say the French government owned these items or had these items and put them on display in various national buildings, did they identify or indicate where these things came from, or did it just say from the French National Collection?
Usually not, no. I mean, only in recent years they would start to distinguish that it was an M&R piece. Once people became more aware that this collection even existed, it wouldn't have been identified as anything out of the ordinary. It would have been, you know, displayed next to a Leger or a Brock without any indication that it had been plundered in the past.
That's fascinating, because it gets, you said something I thought that was critically important, and that is sort of how conceptions of what's ethically correct have evolved over the years. I mean, that would seem sort of a no-brainer if it came from something that was plundered, even if you didn't know the owner and hadn't identified it, you'd at least indicate that. But it's very interesting to see how that's evolved over time as well. So that's fascinating. Are there artworks that are in similar place? I mean, obviously the Nazis plundered these countries, so France and the Netherlands and Belgium. Are there an amount of artwork in the United States and in museums in the United States that are sort of similarly fall into this category? And I guess that's the first question. And if so, is the United States doing anything about those works of art?
Yeah, so that's the power of the art market. Thousands of items that had been plundered in the Nazi era ended up coming to the United States. And so there have been a number of claims, lawsuits involving US museums. And we see a wide variety in how institutions react. Since we are not a public museum system, we are largely a private system, each institution needs to determine its own approach to a claim, do the provenance research, and determine whether they are going to negotiate with a claimant, restitute a work of art, or oppose the claim. There's a very interesting development going on that I could recommend folks who are interested in these issues and also what's happening in the United States. Pay attention to claims of pieces created by Egon Schiele, an artist, a modernist who had worked with Gustav Klimt. There's a collection from an owner, Fritz Grunbaum, who perished at Dachau. And a number of Schiele works that he had owned worked their way to the United States through various sales and have ended up in American institutions. Last fall, the New York Manhattan DA's office claimed that since these pieces at some point in their history had touched down on New York soil, that it gave them the ability to file a criminal complaint against museums that held these Schiele works, arguing that they were Nazi plunder and that the Manhattan DA's office had the right to seize these pieces. Now, sometimes this means just seizing in place, meaning the museum needs to secure it while they figure out the proper procedures as a result. Several museums in the United States were affected by this. And here is where the ethical dimension really comes into play. Oberlin College decided, we don't want to be part of a controversy over a Nazi plunder. We're giving it back to the descendants of Fritz Grunbaum. Same with the Carnegie Museum outside of Pittsburgh. The Art Institute of Chicago is holding on to theirs and planning to dispute the claim of the descendants, arguing that the family actually did hold that particular Schiele work of art after the war. So the Art Institute of Chicago is taking a very different approach and appears to be preparing for litigation over this case. So that's one to watch. And it reflects how different institutions will respond in different ways. And we have plenty of examples of other museums that decide, like the Denver Art Museum gave up a work that was claimed that had been sold under duress, also saying, we do not want to hold Nazi plunder. But then you can look at a museum like Norton Simon in Pasadena that fought a 10-year legal battle to assert their right to hold 2 paintings that were plundered from the Jacques Houtstikker collection in the Netherlands, and they won. So there can be a big difference in how American institutions respond, and we're working to raise these questions about ethics for the rising generation of curators.
Well, that's fascinating, and I guess the lack of standardization is a really interesting challenge. But given the fact that many of these museums are private museums and they're privately held, a friend of mine, Betsy King, who's joining us from Texas, who is a lawyer, actually asked a question. So this kind of follows up nicely. And her question is, how does a lawyer go about breaking into this very important area of art law? And she's wondering if there were to be some kind of hybrid training program that she or her friends might be able to do that would help prepare them for this kind of litigation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I could certainly refer them to other attorneys who are active in this field. And I know that it tends to be related to intellectual property and copyright law. And I'm not aware of training programs as specifically for legal professionals. But if she were to contact me, I'd be happy to refer her to other attorneys that I know who are working in this area.
Okay, offline, she can send me a note and I'll forward that to you, and you can get in touch with Betsy on that. That would be great. And another question from former student Susan Bowyer. She asks, which is an interesting question. Now, most of us are not museum curators, but as individuals who own art or other historical work, what can we do to be ethical owners? What kind of steps could we reasonably take to be ethical owners of artwork or other historical artifacts?
Yeah, it's a great question. Private owners too really should know the ownership chain of the works that they hold. And this is going to be increasingly important as older generation who had collected after World War II passes on and passes down works of art to a younger generation. And part of what we're trying to do at the Center for Art Collection Ethics is to help create a network of professionals so that there is a registry where one could do a search for a provenance research in one's area that could come in and look at the works of art, look at documentation. So far, that kind of registry still doesn't exist. And so provenance research is still an area that is becoming more professionalized. You can certainly, again, if that person would like to reach out to me, I might be able to recommend folks in a given area that could help with provenance research. But that part of what we're trying to do is to build that kind of network so that people could do the right thing in having even objects that they hold themselves in their homes to make sure that they weren't plundered or sold under duress sometime in the past.
Thank you. That makes good sense. Another question, so coming from Chris McCarthy, which is interesting, and this may be a whole separate book, Professor Campbell, that you could write. But how do these efforts differ in Eastern European states? Obviously, given that in Poland, in what was then Czechoslovakia, and other parts of Eastern Europe, there was a lot of plunder that occurred there. I don't know if you've done any research to indicate sort of what processes some of those states use.
Yeah, so that's an area where there is significant room for improvement. We have not seen the developments like we've seen in Western Europe in recent years. So Poland still has a good deal of work to do itself. It is working very hard to have works restituted to Poland that had been plundered, is not making enough progress in terms of looking at its own collections and whether works that are held by the state should be restituted to private owners. So there both receiving works still, but still have work to do in terms of systematic provenance research and transparency when it comes to works of art held by the state. Same with Hungary. There's an ongoing case that's one to watch. So there's a claim against the Hungarian government for items from the Herzog collection. It's been in litigation for years and may be reviewed by the US Supreme Court. So another one that has a reputation of not being transparent when it comes to doing this kind of provenance research, and is seen as a place where far more progress needs to be made. Of course, the Soviet Union never participated in the repatriation effort. The works of art that were found in Eastern Germany were considered war loot, and they were considered reparations for all the damage that had been inflicted by the Germans in the Soviet Union. So the Soviets never participated in the repatriation effort. To this day, Russia has never shown willingness to restitute works of art that it seized from Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. And there doesn't appear to be any willingness to compromise on that stance. And they continue to maintain that they are just reparations for all the damage inflicted by the Germans during World War II.
And for a quick international law interlude, you're not allowed to do that under international law. So there, in other words, you can say that those are reparations, but that's specifically prohibited under international law from making that claim. I would expect, without knowing, but you may have a better sense, given the vast collections of art in Russia, that there are probably many works that fall into that category.
Yes, absolutely. And part of the tragedy in Ukraine, beyond the most tragic loss of human life, there is also cultural tragedy going on as we speak. I've been stunned as someone who teaches Nazi art looting to watch the process happening again, with Russian trucks backing up to Ukrainian museums and emptying them. So in addition to all the challenges that Ukraine is going to have to face in rebuilding from this current tragic conflict with great loss of human life, there is also going to be a significant challenge in terms of cultural restoration. That's part of what Russia is trying to do, is to destroy a sense of Ukrainian national culture and identity.
And I don't think that's highlighted enough, frankly, as somebody who's been studying the Ukraine war and looking at it from that perspective. I don't think the extent to which this cultural devastation has been taking place has really been reported. So I think that's something very important to take note of. And it also connects to allegations of genocide, because if you're really trying to destroy a culture, this is one way you would go about doing it. And it would sort of support some of those claims that they're trying to destroy the people in whole or in part. We have one final question, and this is from Sophia Chiato, an alumna who asks about auction houses, and really how do we go about holding them accountable? She makes reference to databases like the Art Loss Registry, but how do we put them into this? We've been talking about countries, we've been talking about museums. How do we figure in auction houses and their accountability?
Yeah, so there has been a big shift in the approach of the major auction houses like Christie's and Sotheby's. So they do have provenance research teams that are carrying out research on items that are presented for sale. They should be carrying out their due diligence to make sure that the items that they are putting up for sale haven't been stolen in the past. So they have become much more diligent in recent years. But once we get to smaller auction houses and galleries, that's where a bigger challenge still remains. So that's part of our effort with the Center for Art Collection Ethics, is to send out this message that the people who should be carrying out this due diligence are not just those in museums, but it's also the smaller galleries and auction houses, and that the art market plays a really important role. Antiquities is another major area where this kind of research needs to be done. So we're doing all that we can to make sure that the public is informed, and potential buyers, collectors, so that they know that when they go to an art dealer or an auction house, that they need to have a sense that they're dealing with someone who's reputable. And I think it does help, like the Manhattan DA's efforts to curb art trafficking in New York, I think are having a significant impact into the art market and really working to prevent the trade in stolen art from recent years.
Thank you very much. And sadly, Professor Campbell, we are out of time. We could go on for several more hours. In conclusion, I want to thank Professor Elizabeth Campbell, a great alumna of Georgetown. I want to encourage people to go out and buy this book. It's available on Amazon and it comes very quickly to you. So go out and buy this book. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So I would encourage you to send it to folks that might be interested. I want to thank, obviously, my friend, Professor Campbell. Also, I want to thank Kelly Young of the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in a few weeks on SFS Online and On Topic. Have a fantastic day.